What's going on, all you dads out there and all you moms? Thanks for checking out the latest episode of the Fade You podcast, episode 134. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you support our shows. Subscribe if you're listening to this as a podcast. Give it a like on Twitter. Tell your friends about it. We got a really good episode for you coming up here, and we really appreciate you guys listening. So make sure you are following us on Twitter at Fade You Sports. Make sure you check out our YouTube. Check out the link in our Twitter bio. We got some good stuff coming up there. And check out Fade University on TikTok. We look forward to bringing more TikTok content here through the summer months. My name is Matthew James on Twitter at MatthewJames78. Joined on this special episode by my good buddy, Kmart. Kmart's_angles on Twitter. Kmart, are you excited to talk some hockey?
I'm actually really excited, on the precipice of the NFL draft here, but, furthermore, getting into the NHL playoffs that you would know. I love to degen every now and then.
One of the high peak moments of Kyle and I's friendship is when the Sharks made the run to the Stanley Cup final. Kyle wasn't married yet. He would come over and watch the games. We would yell. We would throw shit. We scared the dog. We scared the neighbors. And that was some of the most fun I've ever had with Kyle. So to get to talk some playoff hockey with him and our special guest here is going to be a really good time. So we're super excited for today's guest. We don't talk a ton of hockey here on the Fade You podcast, but when you listen to this, it's going to be early May, and that means the start of the Stanley Cup playoffs, which are hands down the best tournament in all of sports. So really wanted to have a hockey handicapper on. So we are super thrilled to welcome Alex Smith to the Fade You podcast, and you can find him on Twitter at AXSmithSports. He's a co-host over at the Ice Guys, which is just a fantastic show for hockey fans, hockey bettors. Alex, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for hanging out with us today.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me on. I'm really excited. Always excited to talk hockey with anybody, but especially you guys have me on the pod for the first time and talking to playoff hockey. It's funny you mentioned about how it's early May. It's supposed to be normally would be like we're talking about the second round going into the conference finals, but because everything was pushed back, it felt like two just consecutive long seasons right now, the way things are going. But normally we would be like toward the end of the first round, but here we are, going into the beginning of the playoffs, and it's going to go all the way until I think the 4th of July would possibly be the latest date for Game 7. But so more summertime hockey. This would be the second straight year for that. So.
Yeah, it's great. And Kyle, I remember you when the NBA playoffs started. You were like, "Wait a minute, isn't hockey usually started by now?" So this is kind of a unique, weird anomaly season.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I said something like, I thought NHL was always 2 weeks ahead of the NBA. This is super weird right now. And then you reminded me of the good old Olympics.
Right. Yeah. Right. They're not playing the Olympics, and then they had to, the schedule had to be flipped around. Basically, like 120 games had to be changed around over a span of weeks. And so, the NHL, the schedule makers did a great job, and the league did a good job to fill those gaps in. And so now here we are finally at the playoffs after a long 82 game season.
Can't wait. It's so good. So Alex, before we get started, just talk about how you're Chicago guy. You got the Hawks jersey on. We talked about with our guy Dave Sharapan when we were in Vegas for March Madness. We talked about the best red jerseys in all of sports, and that Hawks red is so good. But just talk briefly about how you fell in love with hockey. Like what makes this what makes it the best sport?
Well, yeah. So I grew up. I was born and raised in the South Side of Chicago. I don't live there now anymore full time. I actually live in St. Paul, Minnesota, but I go back and forth. But growing up in Chicago, and I grew up in the '90s when the Bulls were king, and of course the Bears. You got the Sox. Then there was the Hawks. The storied original six franchise that had obviously had great players. Like I said, one of the more iconic logos in all the sports, one of the more recognized jerseys in all the sports, but they were not good in the late 90s and early 2000s. But I always watched the games on TV. I thought it was just a fun game to watch. And once I got to go to a game, my dad would take me to that, not just the Hawks games, but Chicago Wolves, which back then was in the old International Hockey League. And then they flipped and became AHL teams, so the American Hockey League, that's the affiliate right underneath it. But so watching the games in person, it was just incredible. Just the atmosphere, the fans, and just, back then there was a lot of fighting, so the violence and the hitting, but just the grace of the guys skating around and scoring goals. It was just something different than what you saw from football. It had the physicality of football, it had the structure of basketball, and it had that kind of traditional aspect of baseball all wrapped into one. That's the way I kind of looked at it growing up. And as an African American, there weren't a lot of people that looked like me playing the game. There certainly weren't that many people that looked like me in the stands watching the game. So I had to kind of, in a way, be an ambassador just to try to convince the rest of my family to watch hockey. And so it's kind of funny that now, being in the gambling landscape where hockey kind of plays fourth or fifth fiddle at times, I still have to kind of have that ambassador role for a different reason. But and I love that. I love spreading the word of hockey to anyone that wants to listen to it. Like, I'm such a fan, and I like talking about the game. And so, to try to get somebody to say, and since I've been betting on hockey and had the Ice Guys podcast, and been selling picks and different things for the last 10 years, I've had so many people that email me, DM me all the time. They say, "Hey, I didn't even watch hockey, or I never thought about hockey until I heard you talk about it on the radio or a podcast." Now, not only do I bet on the games, I watch the games. I'm a fan of this team or that team, So it's been really cool to, like, my fandom growing has now led to other people becoming fans. That's what it's really all about, in my opinion.
And in some ways, it's never been easier to become a hockey fan. ESPN Plus and what they have done this season
Yes.
has been so good. And I mean, I never had like NHL Center Ice or any of that. So it's so much fun being on the West Coast here to get home from work and turn on ESPN Plus. Who am I going to watch today? Maybe I'll watch the Flyers today. Maybe I'll watch the Leafs today. Like, it's such a cool opportunity to be able to just watch more games. So, and I think one thing you mentioned too about being able to go to the game and experience the atmosphere. Like, I've never been to a Hawks game at the United Center, and even when they're not good, that just sounds so fun. Like, we've got, here in SoCal, we got the Kings and the Ducks, and even, the Ducks are having a miserable season. They had a game against the Kings last week down there at the Honda Center, and that was an insane environment with that rivalry, and the Kings are playoff bound, and the Ducks are going to get up for that game. And going to a hockey game and experiencing that atmosphere, I mean, even people who aren't hockey fans, like, you'll get hooked. It is such a fun sport to be a part of live.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, growing up, when I went to Hawks games as a kid, there were times, I mean, they would literally give away the tickets. You could sit in the upper deck, and then they tell you to come down to the, the lower levels, because they didn't want, the TV cameras to see all these empty seats. And then all of a sudden, the resurgence turns around in 2010, 2013, 2015. They win the Stanley Cups. All of a sudden, it's a sellout. Get 8-year sellout streak, and that's when it was just at its peak. So for me to be at a Hawks game against Columbus when there was 400 people there in total, and the Hawks were losing 6-2, and then to turn around and go to a Hawks playoff game where they're beating Vancouver 7-4 to advance to the next round at 22,000 people, it was really cool to kind of, that's what we love about being a fan of sports. That's why we're fans of teams, because when you stick through the good and the bad, it makes those great times even more magnificent. Like you said, you guys are Sharks fans. All the years where the Sharks, came up close, came up short, conference final loss here, sweep there. All of a sudden, they get to win the Western Conference and go to a Cup final. Fortunately, didn't win it, but still, just to be there, it made that. I'm sure that moment was big for you guys as fans, because, like, wow, you guys remember the days of them getting crushed by Colorado and other teams. So that's what we love about sports in general, but especially hockey. The ascent and descent of hockey, I think, is more noticeable. A parity, if you will. It's really a big thing, especially now in the salary cap era.
Totally, for sure. You mentioned the good times and the bad. Kyle's about ready to go through that with the Lakers here with the bad. So good luck. Good luck with that, buddy. Okay, so you talk about, why we love the game. It's such a fun sport. Now, how did you get into betting it? Like, at what point did you say, this is I love hockey. I'm going to learn how to bet it, and I'm going to learn how to be good at it.
So now that's a whole different story. So I've been gambling since I was a little kid. I come from a gambling background. My grandfather used to shoot pool and dice. It's pretty much how he made his money on the weekends when he wasn't driving a cab. My grandma always used to go to the casino, play bingo. So I've always been someone who's like gambling in the family. And so I've always bet on sports, but I always usually just bet on college or pro football, maybe a little NBA or a little college hoops during March Madness. And so when I got into betting full time around 2012. I was actually a musician and ended up getting sick and couldn't perform for a while. So I took my hobby and just decided, I'm like, hey, I got a little extra money at the time. Let me try to do this like the professionals. And got to talk to a lot of people. Twitter was the biggest help. Just got to know a lot of people through Twitter. One way to another, listening to a bunch of shows. I ended up getting on ESPN radio out in Las Vegas with Dave Koken, legendary handicapper, Matt Humans, who's now hosting with VSiN. Those guys got me on because they're like, hey, you bet hockey? And I'm like, yeah, like I just started betting hockey. It was right after the 2011, 2012 lockout. And that's when I decided, I'm like, I'm like, I know hockey pretty much better than basketball and just as well as football. And I'm like, I didn't quite understand the money line aspect until I started, betting more with football. And so I was just kind of, like I said, just learn to adjust and realize how the game goes according to the numbers. I mean, you can watch a sporting event, and if you don't know anything about gambling, you don't understand the totals and the spreads and the sides. So I understood that aspect well before, but just putting it together with hockey because I was just a fan and never really bet on it. It took a little bit of a time, but I got pretty good at it. I mean, I had a good first season, and from there, I ended up doing radio spots on ESPN Radio in Las Vegas a couple times during the playoffs, and then that turned into people following me on Twitter, and then now me having on my own website, and me being put on other people's websites. And I realized that, like I said, it's just that I was able to break down the game in a way where, okay, I can find a way to make money at this, consistently, where, I have hot and cold spells in the NFL and NBA. I was just consistently making more money in hockey than any other sport. So that's became the forefront of it, and the biggest drawback that I got, or at least criticism I got for people, they're like, well, you're such a big Blackhawks fan, but can you be subjective? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, I grew up watching the Hawks being one of the worst teams in the league. I can tell you when they're going to play bad or when they're going to play good, and I love them no matter what. But I'm not gonna, money's a different thing. I'm not gonna waste money because I'm like, oh, I love my Hawks, but if they're not gonna win, they're not gonna win. I'm gonna go bet on the other side. So so I had to make that split in my head too, which I think a lot of gamblers, casual, recreational, professional, have to, you have to make that decision in your head that you can't bet with your heart. And so once I learned that, and that didn't take much time, then the wheels were off from there. Just kept going, and like I said, had all these shows and stuff now, and like I said, it's my most successful sport for over the last 10 years.
Wow. So you say don't bet with your heart?
Do not bet with your heart. No, absolutely not.
If you don't know anything about me yet, I am the resident homer here at
Oh
Fade.
yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'm
Gotcha.
pretty sure the first 10 hockey bets I ever had were definitely Sharks money line. And it was definitely during that 2016 run. And I think they got down in a series, and I was just like, Matt, come on, let's just throw it in. Oh, puck line. Come on, let's just kill it. And I remember laying the -1.5 at like, God, plus 180 or something. And we got the empty netter at the end. I mean,
nice.
Absolutely crazy. So that was definitely how I got into it. But I mean, not hockey related, but I've always been like a quick, like DGen, first to 15, first to 10. So I kind of started looking at, hockey first period over, first team to score in the first 10 minutes, things of that nature. Did you ever, dabble in that? And if so, what's your favorite, or are they just all to you just a crapshoot, and the better to just stay away?
Well, I'll tell you the story of the first period overs and why they've become absolutely insane in the last 3.5 years. That's partly my fault because what happened this had to be so 2019. It's like let's say November 2018, because it's the last road trip. The Hawks used to always do a long West Coast road trip during the Thanksgiving time, because the circus would always be in town in Chicago, and they always played poorly in that stretch, no matter what, no matter how good or bad they were that season. And Hawks end up losing the game like 4-2. I'll never forget Patrick Kane in an interview. He says, we're getting off these bad starts lately. He says, it's like all of a sudden 5 minutes in, we're down a goal, and then we have to play catch up. And when he said that, I went back and looked at all the other box scores, and I go, oh yeah, they were down 2-1 in the first against Vancouver, 2-0 against San Jose, tied 1-1 against Toronto. Then going back, I'm like, they've been cashing these first period overs. Now, I didn't pay attention to first period overs in hockey. I always knew about first halves, mostly in the NBA. That's probably like the biggest thing I did in the NBA was first half plays. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll just take that kind of same concept to it. I'm like, first period. And then when I looked, I'm like, well, this number never moves. It's at 1.5 all the time. They might move the juice, and even then, the juice wouldn't move past $1.30. So, all right, well, I'm just gonna just keep. And I'm not one of those people that just automatically bet something, but that's what I did with the Hawks. Automatically bet their first period over. They went 20-2 after already going like 9-1 from the time that I looked that up. Then all of a sudden comes the Tampa Bay Lightning. Powerful offense. Not the goaltending was a bit sketchy at times. Started tracking them. They went 17-3. The Pittsburgh Penguins, another team, shaky goaltending, great offense. So all these teams came about, and I end up sending a DM on Twitter to Mitch Moss at VSiN, who hosts Follow the Money, the morning show. And I said, hey, I don't know if you guys know about this. I said, but the Blackhawks are on this crazy run with these first period overs. I said, it might be something you want to, talk about. You guys are talking about hockey, because I know most shows never, if they talk about hockey, it's for 4 seconds, and they usually just want to talk about Connor McDavid or, Sidney Crosby, and then just move along. So they started talking about it, and I didn't really listen to the show that often because it came on like 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. All of a sudden, everybody's like talking about, oh yeah, first period overs, and it's like Follow the Money talking about first period overs, and I'm like, yeah, I was the one that told them about that. So all of a sudden, people started betting it, and because it caught fire with them, the book started moving the juice. It starts going, you got to lay 160, you got to lay 170, 185. Then the offshore books, they said, we're not even dealing with this. We're going to 2. So they started moving the numbers, and it just got out of control. And here we are 3 years later. Literally last night, I think all but maybe 2 games had opening first period totals at 2. So, like I said, I've kind of become destroyer of worlds, to use the Oppenheimer reference. But it was a money maker, and then all of a sudden, you have to kind of really do some homework about it, because now they're moving the numbers. But it was just sitting there stagnant, and it just shows you how the books neglected hockey, and they still neglect hockey in certain ways. Where if something like that, you find a trend that's 20-2 in the NFL or the NBA or college football, the books are going to adjust that halfway through, and it's just going to be happenstance and luck that it keeps going past 10-1.
Yeah.
Well, in the NHL, there's a lot of streaks that go by, and because there's always something else that has the books and the casual bettor's attention. Like March Madness, February, Super Bowl, go back, January, playoffs, college football, college basketball. There's always something else. There's never this. The irony of possibly with the NBA being over in early June, the only thing that the NHL might have to compete with by the time the Cup final arrives would be Major League Baseball. So, and that's the first time we could ever say that, even during
I call that baseball diarrhea.
right? And even with during the bubble, the bubble started August 1st, 2020. Well, that was the same day the NBA restarted their bubble. So there's never really been a time in history from a betting aspect where the NHL has taken complete control. That's at the forefront. And so the books haven't really had to deal with it as often. But that first period overtrend was something that the books had to really deal with. And I talked to a lot of bettors in Vegas and bookmakers, and they said, we got crushed in the first couple months of that trend. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, first period overs is definitely one of my favorite bets, and that's something that I've did help make what the phenomenon it's become nowadays. So
right,
that is I did not know that story. I mean, so because I remember it, and you're right, it was about 3 years ago, and all of a sudden you started hearing about the Follow the Money 5. And those were some of the teams. It was the Hawks. It was the Lightning. It was the Penguins.
Sure.
Penguins. And I think the Sharks were in there too, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right. Yeah. That's crazy. Yeah. So, oh my God. And those are fun. It's, our guy, Joe, who's not on this one with us, he got into the score in first inning in baseball, the Yurfie and the Nerfie and stuff like that. And the first period over is kind of hockey's version of that, right? It's quick. It's one period. You're rooting for goals really fast right away. It's kind of a way to scratch that itch and turn on a game and have some action right away. It's so fun.
Yeah. And, and the thing is too, because of that, it led to me getting into more live betting with hockey, because when you're watching that, you're obviously, like I said, you're waiting for your 2 goals, but you're watching the pace of play. and you're seeing, okay, wow, if the first period over hits in 5 minutes, well, this game seems like could be nuts. We might see 8 or 9 goals, or there's a lot of penalties, a lot of sloppy passing. So you can use that first period, that first period totals play, whether you go over or under, and watch that, and then that can kind of give you a reference of what you're looking for the rest of the game. So if you're a live better and you're looking for in-game spots, having that kind of cassette foundation, I think that's even easier, where some people would bet a full game side or total and then want to adjust in game. It's like, no, you can do that, but in the back of your mind, it's just human nature. We're all thinking about the first bet we made, that we want our side to win, our total to win. But when you have something that's like a first period, a first quarter, first half, and if you're done with it, whether you want to lose, then you can kind of open up your mind to the rest of the game. So, for second half bets, for live bets, I think it's kind of a good way to kind of split and separate things in your mind. So you won't get caught up with, your full game bet and you're like, trying to make a live wager, say, well, if this happens and then this happens, I win both of them. No, you can't do that. You have to kind of just take things one at a time. So betting first periods and hockey kind of helped me to become a better live better as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're definitely, I'm definitely guilty of trying to find that middle.
Right.
I know Matt's the hockey guy, out of all of us. And I remember a few years ago, he brought up the point of in-game betting, but betting the team who got scored on first. So you're down 1-0, but then you're getting the odds. But right. I kind of took it one step. I was like, okay, if I'm not gonna lay the -1.5, I'm going to hope maybe they get down 1-0 and then I can get, -125, something like that, before it was juiced in the 300s.
Mm-hmm.
And, this year I really got into regulation line betting over the puck line, just because it's, well, in the long run, I'm probably going to win more games by one.
Sure.
And I understand you can get that 40 cent, where maybe you're getting +120 and that's sexier than still laying -125. But, if it's a good bet, I'm like, I don't care. So I'm kind of curious, if you see something similar, if one of them's a sucker bet to you, maybe both of them are.
No, actually, when I first started betting hockey, puck line favorites were something that I was able to cash with a lot. And like I say, get those great plus prices, 180, sometimes 2-1. But then all of a sudden, it seemed like teams started not converting empty net goals. And what I realized was that teams were starting to play this kind of prevent style, where they were just chipping the puck, right into the neutral zone, trying to get the puck to spin and roll a little bit to kill off clock. And it really backfired on some teams, because then you saw, a lot of teams come back and tie a game up. So eventually what that kind of led to, and I've always looked at regulation in the three-way lines, because I've always mostly been betting offshore. But the biggest thing I noticed, and this was also kind of came about, this was one of the first seasons of the Ice Guys podcast. And, on that show, 4 of us, we're on every day. There's one of us or a group of us on every single day during the season, the playoffs. So we always have to kind of look for content. And some days, there's really not really much to bet on. And so during the playoffs, I started noticing, like, well, playoffs, there's always, everybody talk about playoff overtime hockey. Mm-hmm. And it was 2018 postseason. Like, I can maybe even go back a little bit further than that, where the record was broken for it was like 17 or 18 overtimes in the first round of all the first round matchups. So once again, looking at the numbers and seeing that, and I'm like, oh, well, the draw is always around +300, +320, sometimes +350. So I just started betting those during the playoffs. And that became another kind of crazy phenomenon, where people are just like, wow, I'm hitting these overtimes left and right. And, like I said, every one of them's, no worse than 3-1. Well, hell, you can go 25% and with 3-1 odds and turn at least a small profit. So that's been a thing that I've done a lot during the regular season. I'll definitely be doing it during this postseason, like I've been doing every postseason since going back to then. Looking for those overtime spots. You can tell when they play tight, and especially the second half of the season. I always recommend this. You got teams that are playing for points and positioning, and they're tied 2-2 or 3-3 with 5 minutes left in the third. They're not going to risk a cross ice pass or a crazy play or a breakout, and then give up an odd man rush the other way, give up a goal, lose the game in regulation, and not have a point in the standings. So you can tell where teams were tightening their sticks up and kind of just saying, hey, it's a mutual agreement. Let's just 3 minutes left. Let's just settle this in overtime. and let's take our points because we need our points for the standings and we go our separate ways. So that theory has really helped me, and especially this the last 2 months of this season, I've cashed a lot of draw plays. Like I said, the cheapest price I cashed was maybe plus 305. The highest one I cashed was plus 410 about maybe about 3.5 weeks ago. So
Yeah,
that's things like
that's
that.
good
Yeah.
because like Matthew over here, I know we were doing a battle of the dads last month in March,
Mhm.
and he was a little bit behind, kind of chasing. He played the
Draws. Yeah.
and he kind of made the point of about almost a third of NHL games this season have been going to overtime.
Mhm.
And I was just like, it's funny you say that because it's about the same for soccer, because I've been known to dabble in soccer every now and then.
Okay. Yeah.
Matches I know, it's the same thing. So if I take a certain side, a lot of times I'll not parlay it, is we're used to the term, but I'll limit some risk and go on the draw as well, because we're talking 30% of games. So it's similar to you. A lot of these teams, when it's in the 90th minute, they're not going to risk similar types of plays.
Yeah, and now with the advancement of betting here in the U.S., the books like the DraftKings, FanDuels, etc., they have a lot more options that the offshore books have had for years. So there's things like double chance. You can bet a side. So like yesterday, Ian, one of the hosts on the Ice Guys, he had Arizona and the draw. Game goes to overtime, and then Arizona wins it. So he ends up hitting that. So those kind of derivatives and kind of combo wagers. Now some of them are sucker bets, especially you start looking at bet boosts and things of that nature. But there are a lot of these derivative wagers where if you just kind of sit down, do a little extra homework, you can spot some trends and find some angles that like I said, the books they're gonna post that same number over and over unless something drastic happens. There's a drastic run, but hell, you can cash 6 or 7 of those in a row and then get out of Dodge and you've made your money. So that's the thing. So I think with any sport, if you know and look for just certain nuances, certain things, and even as a fan or just a casual observer, and then you find the numbers, if everything correlates together, then it makes for a good wager.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it. So let's talk playoffs a little bit. You mentioned betting draws in the play. Stakes are higher in the playoffs. Teams will just naturally. I mean, we'll see what happens with these totals because this has been an over season in the NHL for sure. So we'll see if we get some lower scoring, tighter overtime games in the playoffs. But when you look at betting the NHL playoffs, is there anything different in your approach, like certain things you look for that are specific to the playoffs versus the regular season?
Yeah, not so much. I mean, there'll be some things like, people always wanted to look at, obviously, when you talk about a playoff matchup, how did those two teams fare against each other in the regular season? Or, even if they had playoff history before. So there's some angles that I would kind of factor into my handicap, and won't be, just as gospel. It's not the number one reason I'm going to make a bet on play A or side B or what have you. But I will take some of those things into consideration, and sometimes they backfire. Perfect example was in the bubble postseason. You had Carolina and New York play, and the New York Rangers had dominated Carolina for like 15 years in the regular season. If you go back, and what was really odd about it was not only that it was like, I mean, we're talking about like a 28-7 run, but when you look in the box scores of those games, most of the times Carolina would be out shooting the New York Rangers by a 2-1 margin, and then somehow end up losing the game 3-1. So you just wonder, okay, well, sometimes it's not always, and we talk about, different lineups, different coaches, different years. Sometimes just some teams just don't fare well in certain buildings. It's like, okay, maybe Carolina, do they go out and party a little bit before they play at Madison Square Garden or what have you? There's something to that angle. Didn't matter in the bubble. They're, playing, I forget where the Eastern Conference even was with the bubble, but long story short, they swept out the New York Rangers. And even looking at this year, and if this year, Carolina has dominated the Rangers as well. So what had been a long going trend that I've been automatically betting for years and years, and was actually betting and getting plus prices often with the Rangers, now it's flip flopped. Since that playoff bubble matchup, Carolina has dominated the New York Rangers. So things change. You can't rely everything on a trend, everything on previous history, but it's something you do add into and look at when you're looking at series and different games throughout the postseason.
It's interesting. You mentioned histories, and there's some teams in these playoffs. Like, is this the year that the Leafs get out of the first round? Like, there's some really compelling storylines, and we're recording this on Thursday, so we're a little bit fortunate. We at least know who's in. We don't know the final matchups yet, but do you have a take on the Golden Knights missing the playoffs? I mean, I think this is a pretty wild situation. Like, I don't know if we'll ever see a team that is as capped out as they are, that went all in. Tampa was capped out last season. They won the cup. These guys didn't even make the playoffs. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and that's where you're gonna see this in the cup era and in the salary cap era, I should say, where teams are going to, try to go all in for a year or two. And if they don't win it, then well, they got to, figure things out. And for Vegas, I mean, listen, the fans, I'm sure they're upset. Obviously, you don't never want your team to miss the postseason, but you guys have had a team for 5 years, and the first year you go all the way to the Stanley Cup final. You can't complain about anything. All right, like the most successful expansion season of any team in any sport ever. And so I guess that kind of, obviously that builds some kind of a rapport where the fans say, hey, this can happen every year. And sure enough, 4 years in a row, they made the playoffs and made deep runs in those postseasons. Of course, didn't win anything, but, so now for them to miss out, I think it's going to be obviously a wake-up call to that organization, because the way they handled things the last year and a half, the whole goalie thing back and forth with getting rid of Fleury, Leonard going back and forth, and now he might be on the outs possibly after the season. So those things, they got to set a lot of things in house. And when you look at how things broke down for them as we're taping this, Vegas had lost 5 of the last 6 games. 3 of the 3 straight games had gone into a shootout. 17 shooters. So it was a 3-round shootout against San Jose and a 7-round shootout each against Dallas and Chicago. No goals scored from any of those. And if you watched them, I watched the Chicago one last night and the Dallas one the night before. There was no creativity, no movement. You weren't seeing guy. You see a guy like a Alexander Barkov or a Patrick Kane try to do some fancy move or a dangle or a slow down and stuff. There was nothing. It was like these guys were just. It was as if you were playing NHL on a PlayStation and your controller got unplugged the last second. That's the way these guys were approaching goalies in the shootout. And it's like, these are your biggest games of the season, and this is how you end up the contest. So I mean, there's a lot of things. Obviously, they got bit by the injury bug too. COVID hit them. They made the move for Jack Eichel, and they were waiting for him to get healthy, and then he comes back, and he's kind of up and down, which can't blame him. The guy came off of neck surgery. So it's just one of those things. They had a bad season. It's going to happen to every team, and Vegas fans now realize that, hey, your team's susceptible to having bad seasons as well. So it's not the shocking thing. It's not the end of the world. They're gonna be back, and they have a rabid fan base that's going to push them to spend money and bring in top players and be one of the top teams in the Western Conference again. So I don't think this is gonna be a fall off the face of the earth for the Golden Knights in any form or fashion.
So what was worse, the Golden Knights season or the Lakers season?
I don't know. They're both because you know what? I'm gonna say the Golden Knights season. This is why, because the Lakers, when the Lakers made all those moves, and I'll never forget, I texted a good buddy of mine who's a big basketball fan, and looking at all the ages of everybody on that team, I said, good thing they play in LA, because if they were an East Coast team, they wouldn't even be able to stay awake for the second half of their games. I mean, we're talking about, guys, this was like the 2012 All-Star team, but now they're trying to win a title in 2022. Yeah. And so they kind of fell apart, LeBron, the whole load management, not even load management. I mean, he just got hurt. These guys are getting all banged up. And they're in their mid-30s, and they played a lot of basketball and a lot of brilliant. And when you think about it, and this is something that I'll talk about too when you talk about looking at playoffs, is how long of it has a team or a player, have been going to the postseason year after year after year. So you had LeBron, who made 9 or 10 straight NBA finals. That's a lot of basketball. You play in 82 games, or at least let's say 75. You're taking some off in the season. Then you got your 20, 22, 24 game postseason. You're doing that year after year after year. You get worn out. You can be the greatest athlete of all time. You're still going to get worn out. You're still a human being. And you can say that with teams as well. You look at dynasties Golden State, to bring it back to hockey, the Blackhawks, the LA Kings, and the Penguins were the three dynasties of the 2010 era. Pittsburgh's the only team that really hasn't fallen off, which is shocking because they've dealt with injuries year after year after year after year. And I mean, key injuries. I mean, there hasn't been a time in the last 5 or 6 years where we talk about, Evgeny Malkin's out 2-3 weeks, Sidney Crosby's out a month with this, and they've still been able to find ways to win and make the postseason every year. But where teams like LA and Chicago, they had their big runs, and when it fell apart, man, did it fall apart. So, that's the thing. You play so much hockey, and that's something we have to look at with Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay has played so much hockey in the last several years. Going back to 2015, they were in the Cup final. They only missed the playoffs once in this span from 15 to current. And to win back-to-back Stanley Cups, something that we've only seen 3 teams do in the last 25 years. Not only do you have a target on your back, but you guys are just you have to be mentally and physically exhausted at some point because you've just played that much hockey, and especially with the condensed schedules of the bubble, the condensed schedules you've had this year. That's why we're seeing more overs now in the second half of the season, where things would tighten up and slow down and be more defensive. These goalies are just having rough nights. These blue liners are having rough nights, and we're still seeing high scoring games. So that's something that I think needs to be taken into consideration with any postseason, but especially basketball and hockey. I think looking at postseason, when you're looking at futures or looking at series prices, look at how many games does this team really play? Like are these guys, do they have the energy and can they dig deep down enough to find the energy to win another 7-game series? That's something you really have to ask before looking at any kind of series price or any scenario betting in the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. Good riddance to the Golden Knights. As a Sharks fan, I got no sympathy and
sure.
and no love for those assholes. So good riddance.
It's funny because it seems like everybody just hates Vegas now too. Like I actually saw the Golden Knights here in Minnesota with a friend of mine, and she's just like, I can't stand Vegas. And I'm like, well, what's really wrong with them? I'm like, okay, like do you not like their fans because they're just like all kind of slightly entitled because once again they started off with having a great run at the beginning of their existence, and I'm like the players aren't the players are fine. I don't really know anything about their ownership and coaching staffs, enough to say that I like or hate them. But it just seemed like when they got it bounced last night, everybody on Twitter was just like rejoicing. Like it's like you would think this was like the Yankees getting bounced out of the playoffs or something like that. People do not like the Vegas Golden Knights. So.
It's for sure. I mean, and when the Sharks beat them in the shootout, you had all the Stars Twitter was all over it. The LA Kings Twitter was all over it. And it didn't, as I was scrolling through that night, I kind of realized man, everybody around the entire league just hates these guys.
Yeah.
And I guess it's just because of the way they built their team. It's just cherry picking guys from every other team every year. It's like,
yeah, but that's how expansion. But here's the thing, and everybody thought with Seattle coming in the league this year, that would be a repeat of the same thing. They're just going to cherry pick and they picked the top guys that were available. It's just that the year Vegas came in the league, there were so many good players that were available under the rules of the draft, because you have all these protection rules and different things, and they just got the luck of the draw. If you flip flopped them around, or if it had been any other team, they may have not, or if they didn't have the management and staff to pick those guys, we probably wouldn't have seen that. We probably would have seen what we're seeing with Seattle. Seattle's finishing last place in the Pacific this year. So it's a fluke thing. I wouldn't take it too personally as a fan of another team. They got lucky, and it's something we'll probably never see again. If we do see any more teams expanding in sports, which I doubt we will, there's so many of them. But if we do, I highly doubt we'll ever see another expansion team in any sport make it as far and be as successful in the first year as the Vegas Golden Knights were. Yeah, it seems like there's no way. So what are the storylines in the playoffs that you're looking forward to most this year? You just talked about the Lightning and touched on them. I mean, them versus the Leafs in round one is fascinating because the Leafs are hungry. The Lightning are going for the three-peat. Yeah. You got that. You got, the Panthers being one of the best teams in the league for probably the first time ever. You got the Avs. They're trying to do it. The NHL wants McDavid and the Oilers to make a run. What are the best stories around the league in your opinion? Yeah, I mean, the Florida Panthers. I think that's a really exciting one that people aren't even talking about more than they should be talking about it more than they really are. this team was just kind of just left in the wind for years and years, and you just wonder, how are they even still in Florida? There's only 2,000 people showing up the games. They aren't winning. They aren't spending a lot of money, but they were able to draft well. They got Dale Talon as their GM, and he's the guy who helped build that Hawks dynasty, and he helped build and make and move pieces. And now Florida. It's funny. Last year we joked around about Florida leading the league in attendance, and said, yeah, well, it took a worldwide deadly pandemic for that to happen. And then all of a sudden, no, actually they have a pretty good hockey team and people now want to come out and see them. So the Florida Panthers are a legit story in the Eastern Conference and in the league. And I think they will make a deep run in that East, and that'll be something to definitely keep an eye on. As far as, like I said, Tampa and Toronto, that is definitely going to be the series. And Toronto, 18 years since they've won a postseason series, which is insane when you think about all the talent that they've had. Even those years, it was the end of the Matt Sundin era and that stuff. And then, they went through a little bit of hardship in the, early 2000s, early 2010s. But then you get Austin Matthews, you get John Tavares, you got Mitch Marner, you had Freddie Anderson as a goalie for a while. He's gone now. They got Jack Campbell, who looked great last year for a time. They've had all these great players, but they haven't been able to put it together as a whole. They've had offense, no defense. Then the offense dries up when the defense starts playing well. Then they don't have any goaltending. Then they have goalie injuries. So it's just been a string of bad luck for them, where now they got to play the defending back-to-back Stanley Cup champions. And like you said, maybe there's something there where, the hungry wolf that is the Toronto Maple Leafs playing a possibly tired team in the Tampa Bay Lightning. So that's a fun series to watch too. And then right here in my backyard now in Minnesota, the Wild making a huge run, and talk about a franchise that needed a culture change. They got it with Dean Evison as their head coach and Bill Guerin as their general manager. Those are two fiery personalities, and now that has rubbed off on the players, and it's rubbed off on the fans around here as well. Like, it's a whole different vibe being around town when it's a night game for the Wild, or going to an actual game, or even now you go to the bars and people are in there just sitting at the bars watching the games, the road games, instead of being at home. They're actually going to go. Groups are going out and watching the game. So it's a fun atmosphere. Even though I'm certainly not a Wild fan, I'm a Hawks fan, but to live in enemy territory, but to witness it. It's a great thing, because this is a franchise that had a lot of talent and a lot of postseason disappointment, and now they've put it together. They're doing things the right way, and they've got a squad that's awfully dangerous, and I think could make some real noise in the West this postseason.
Yeah.
What about? Or go ahead, Kyle.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that's really good info.
What about these narratives that you hear in terms of the playoffs? Like, all right, a team down 0-2 going home is a play on, and they're a score first, stuff like that. Some of these like situations, or elimination games. If a team's got their back against the wall, they may pull the goalie earlier, so you can look at a third period over. What about some of these other like very specific things to the playoffs?
Yeah, and some of them are team specific. For example, the Hawks throughout their run in the playoffs over the that last decade, they always lost game one, and they always lost the first game on the road. It was like this was like a long-term trend for about maybe 5 or 6 postseasons. So you can find little spots like that, and it might, like I said, it's something that maybe add to your handicap. It wouldn't be the end all be all and just automatic play. But some of those narratives you can look into, but you have to, in my opinion, if I see one thing, I want to tie it in with something else. I'm not just going to blindly bet, okay, the team's down 0-2 going home, or if it's a 3-1, a 3-1 or 3-2 spot, this team usually closes out series within 6 games or something like that. So it all depends on the series and how things are going. You really have to take it game by game as far as that goes. You did bring up a good point about the elimination game third period overs. That's something that we kind of uncovered a few years ago, where we've noticed, the goalies are getting pulled earlier and earlier in games, because, like I said, teams aren't trying to get the empty net if they're up with the lead. They're trying to chip the puck away, and it gives that trailing team time to set up and really develop a play, as opposed to you're not just going down and just automatic icing and you're trying to start from scratch. No, a lot of times you'll see teams that tie games when they're down 1 goal or 2 goals, because that team that's up, they're playing with their backs against the wall when they really should be trying to press even more. So when you have an elimination spot, obviously this is it. It's win or go home. You're going to see coaches take chances and pull the goalie with 5 minutes left. And once again, those totals when you start talking about second period, third period totals, what the books have done with those over the years, because they've gotten popular just like the first period totals, they still haven't adjusted the number. They've only adjusted the price. So yes, you might have to lay 250 on a 1.5 in the third period of an elimination game. But when you're seeing the trend of 19-6, in 1 year of third period overs cashing in elimination games, what's 250? Especially when, obviously you want to be mindful with your bankroll. I'm a guy who has very strict parameters with my bankroll, but I wouldn't lay 250 on anything other than maybe a boxing match normally in the year. But if that particular spot, and this is the end of the season, I'll take a chance with that. I'll take a risk with my bankroll and lay 250 on a spot, because I know what's going to happen. This team's, they're already up, 2-1, 3-1. We're going to see goals galore because they're going to pull that goalie. And if they go down 4-1, they're going to pull that goalie again, because maybe we make it 4-2. They have a window in which, if we're down 2 goals, hell, if we're even down 3 goals, we can still make it a game if we have this much time left. And that ends up, leading to a lot of overs in the third period of elimination games during the playoffs.
Yeah, that's great. And the empty net situations in those, at game 6 down 3-1, like you can find stuff like that for sure. So we're fade you. Is there any team that you're thinking is a fade in these playoffs? We know the 16. Any team that you're a little lower on or a little suspicious of?
Two of the wild card teams. I'll give you one in the East and one in the West. Washington Capitals in the East and the Nashville Predators in the West. Washington's a team I'm surprised they even made it to the postseason. I thought after last year, the way they got bounced by Boston, they're a much older team, still trying to hang on the pieces from that Stanley Cup win they had years ago. Ovechkin's, he's defying his age at 36 years old, playing like an MVP, but the rest of those guys have kind of fallen out of favor, and the goaltending's been really spotty. And now they might have to play Florida. When we talk about how loaded they are offensively and the goaltending talent they have, I wouldn't be shocked to see Florida sweep Washington. And then on the flip side, you got Nashville, where as of right now, they're either going to play Colorado or Calgary. And either way, that spells doom for either matchup, especially now possibly UC Saros not being available for the beginning of that series, their goaltender. You're going to have to go to David Riddick, who has been horrific lately. We've been seeing a lot of goals. I think he's actually like on an 8-1 run to the over whenever he starts. So that's Nashville. Whenever David Riddick is in net, that's not something you really want to have going into game 1 of a playoffs, where you're going to possibly have to either go into the high altitude and crazy arena of Colorado, or the equally as crazy and tough, talented team in Calgary. So those are 2 teams I would definitely be looking to fade. I more than likely would be fading them in their respective game 1s. Now, not necessarily playing the money line. I might be looking at team totals for their opponent or things of that nature, because these are the only games where you might only, first round is probably the only time you're going to see prices of, minus 160 to minus 200. You're not going to see that as we get into the semifinals, and certainly not in the conference finals or cup final. So you still have to kind of keep that same, at least for me, regular season mindset of, okay, I'm not going to lay anything more than 140 on a money line or 150 on a money line, or if I see a total of 6, which this year we're probably going to see 6s and 6.5s in the playoffs, where years before you see 5.5s, and then as it gets tighter down, you see 5s. I'll never forget the LA St. Louis. I think back in like 2013 or 14, we saw 4.5s. Those days are long gone. We're going to be seeing 6s and 6.5s, and hell, maybe even 7s when you start talking about Florida and Toronto, and some of these high powered offenses that have Colorado, exactly right. So you're going to have. I think this is going to be the first postseason, at least since I've been betting following, where the regular season is going to almost kind of continue on a little bit numbers wise in that first round. We won't see the playoff numbers change, in my opinion, until we get into the second round and deeper.
That's a great point. I think you're right too. Let's end with this. So our guys, Chris and Joe, who are not on our show with us today, they love hair pieces, and we had a great hairpiece discussion about baseball players recently. Now, what I told those guys on that show is, hey, if you like hair pieces, you got to look at some of these hockey players, especially some of the older guys. Anybody come to mind that's got like amazing hair, either past or present in hockey?
It's funny. I laughed when you said the primer talking about this, because I looked back and I was like, there are a few guys who had some interesting hairstyles. Mike Ricci, you guys are familiar with,
Oh,
this from the Sharks fame. He had that kind
yeah.
of wet, slick back look. That was something that always kind of caught my eye. Mike Commodore, when that run he made with Carolina when they won the cup in 2006, he had the big afro, the big red afro.
Oh, yeah.
That was pretty cool. Kind of a throwback to the 70s. The guys still were rocking afros with no helmets, of course, back then too. And Ally Afraidy, I don't know if that name rings a bell at all. He guy who had one of the hardest shots in the league, defenseman for the Washington Capitals for years in the 90s. He basically had a mullet that was just bald at the top, but he had all this hair down in the back. And it was always funny because most people didn't get to watch him unless you were a Caps fan or lived in the East Coast, but you got to see him during the All-Star game, this 105-mile-an-hour shot, and all of a sudden you see this hair flow in the back, and then all of a sudden there's just nothing up top. So it's like this kind of crazy balding mullet. That's something that stuck with me. So those are the three hairstyles that I've really kind of noticed over the years. And obviously, like I said, the flow, as they call it, in hockey
Oh,
has
yeah.
always been something of nature. Here in Minnesota, they do a thing every year during the high school hockey tournaments. They actually do a video. You can find this on YouTube, where they show the lineups for because a lot of the schools will do traditions. They'll have whole team dyes their hair blonde, whole team does buzz cuts, or guys just do their own style and different things. So they always do a compilation of that for the high school tournaments here in Minnesota. It actually was an ESPN piece at one point. And funny story with that was that Barry Melrose, when he's shooting that piece with ESPN, they actually went to the barber shop here in St. Paul that I go to, a place called 7th Street Barber. So
That's
and
awesome.
all that's on YouTube, and you can find that. But yeah, so hockey, hair is definitely a thing in hockey throughout the years. But those are the players whose hairstyle I remember the most.
It just, when you skate around, it feels so good if you grow it out a
Yeah.
little bit. Just something about the wind and the hair. It's great. And yeah,
And
you
I think
mentioned
I
the
grow
old.
my hair out all the time. I just love feeling the wind in it.
See, yeah, wind doesn't go through my hair. I need a haircut desperately, as you guys can see. But yeah, and I think the biggest thing too, the funny thing is we talk about that. I think hair and hockey go together hand in hand because hell, they weren't wearing helmets for most of the other time. You think about the 60s and 70s, you got to see all these guys' hairstyles.
Oh, yeah.
Nowadays, obviously, everybody's got to wear a helmet. But so I think that's kind of what led to that allure too, of seeing the hair flowing around as guys are skating back, because until the early 80s, these guys didn't wear helmets, so you got to see all the different colorful hairstyles.
And some of those guys back in the day had just legendary mullets. You still see
Oh, yeah.
Melrose rocking the mullet on ESPN,
Yep.
but man, you go back and you look at some of those old hockey highlights, and the mullets these guys rocked were just
Oh yeah,
it's
that
good
was
stuff.
the thing.
Yep.
Before we get going, I had one more kind of follow up. I liked how you said, when a team's down 0-2, you don't typically, just blindly fade them, which is good because, obviously fade you. Oh, they're not going to go down 3-0. So we, definitely like to bet on that team to go up 3-0, every
Right.
now and then. Again, situationally, it works. From your kind of betting knowledge, do the books tend to juice the team down 0-2 more so you can find more of an edge betting wise? Or is that more of a situation where you might say, hey, I want to see the first 10 minutes and then maybe I'm going to attack it?
No, well, the interesting thing is because of the playoff format, and that, if I'm not mistaken, this year it's the same like it'll be before. It'll be 2-2, 1-1-1. So that game 3, you will always tend to see that sometimes most times you'll see that team down 0-2, they're going home. They might actually be a favorite. If they were only a plus 110 or plus 115 dog in game 2, then they'll turn around and easily make them, $1.10 or $1.05 short favorite in game 3 just because they're at home. So sometimes you'll have an edge in that aspect. And then the interesting thing of that is if it goes 3-0, what I've noticed is that usually those lines won't change at all. So you would think a 3-0 spot, okay, well, the team's up 3-0 is going to be a giant favorite. We've seen that like in the NBA, for example, where, just the other night, the Bulls and Bucks were playing. Bucks were a 12.5-point favorite. In hockey, you don't always see that. Sometimes you might see the books come right back. I'll never forget my Hawks playing the Wild from game 3 to game 4. It's the 2015. It's the conference quarterfinal, if I'm not mistaken. And Hawks go up 3-0 on the 1-0 win on the road. That next game, Hawks were minus $1.20. I was like, okay, well, I'm rolling with that. I'm going to lay that because in my eyes, they should be minus 190 or 200 because of the situation. They have the advantage. And must win doesn't mean will win. We always talk about that at the end of the season when teams are trying to get in the postseason. Well, that's the same thing in the playoffs as well. And if a team's lost 3 in a row, more than likely they've lost that for a reason, and there's a good chance they're going to lose a fourth. So it's so much. Hockey's a momentum-based sport in itself, from game to game, shift to shift. But the playoffs in any form, especially of a 7-game series, it's all momentum-based. So if a team loses 3, to go down 2-0 and 3-0, look at their body language when they get off the ice. If that team down 2-0-2, they come over, they're like, all right, you know what? We struggle a little bit, but hey, we're back at our bar now. Let's get things rocking and rolling. And then that's when you go, maybe wait 5 minutes, 10 minutes, see if they got that energy and momentum, and then make a live wager. Conversely, if you see that team dragging their feet, hanging their heads when they skate off the ice, especially if they lose in like a overtime or a double overtime, that fatigue and that feeling of, hey, you know what, our season's pretty much toast, can carry over. And then next thing you know, you want to, that team that's up 3-0, maybe bet for them to score first, bet that first period over, look for, and especially something I like to do live is for which team scores next. So those kind of things. And then if you see a team that's getting blown out, especially in the playoffs, they don't really take their foot off the gas. So you might see a 3-0-4 lead in the game, and they're like, let's stick it to these guys. So you might want to bet them to score again. And now it's 5-0. Now it's 6-0, because they will try to run it up on some teams to, just put that final nail in the coffin.
I like it.
Well, we can't wait for the playoffs to start. And Alex, thanks so much for coming on. And that was a ton of fun, a lot of great info. Definitely, for sure. So make sure everybody, you're following us at Fade U Sports on Twitter. And Alex, just remind everybody where they can catch all your work.
Yes. Follow me on Twitter at AXSmithSports. You can visit my website, axsmithsports.com, and then check out the Ice Guys, which is on YouTube every day throughout the regular season, throughout the playoffs. We'll even have some content coming up during the off season as well. So just look up the Ice Guys on YouTube, and you can find a podcast as well. It's on all available podcast platforms.
And Kyle, before we get out of here, just remind everybody what happens sometimes when you bet on poop, like the Cincinnati Reds 3 times in a row.
You might just get the same exact shitty result.